On the 28th of May, 2001, the surface of Coniston Water lay flat as pewter beneath a low English sky. There was no wind to speak of, only the faintest suggestion of movement along the shoreline, where reeds bent and straightened as though whispering to one another about what was happening further out. A small flotilla of boats had gathered near the center of the lake. Divers in orange vests moved with deliberate calm. A winch groaned, its cable taut and trembling, disappearing into the dark water below. On the bank, a woman in her 50s stood very still. Her name was Gina Campbell, and she had been waiting for this moment for 34 years and 145 days. She had been a teenager when her father went into that water. She was a grandmother now, and yet, watching the cable inch upward, she felt like that girl again, helpless, furious, unable to breathe properly. The divers had found him in the late 1990s. A man called Bill Smith, a diver by passion, an engineer by trade, possessed of a stubbornness that matched the dead man's own, had led the search with a side-scan sonar and a conviction that the lake owed the world an answer. The wreckage lay at considerable depth, preserved by the cold, tannin-dark water of the Lake District. Water so still that time itself seemed to have pooled there, undisturbed, since the 4th of January, 1967. Now the winch pulled, and the lake gave up what it had kept. Among the twisted remains of the cabin, the recovery team found something unexpected in its tenderness. A small stuffed bear, no larger than a man's hand. It had lost its color, bleached by decades of submersion into a ghostly gray, but it had not lost its shape. Its button eyes stared upward, as they had always done, from a face that was neither smiling nor sad, but simply, patiently present. The bear's name was Mr. Whoppit. He had been in the cabin on every record-breaking run his owner had ever made. He had been there on the morning it all ended. And when the craft shattered and the man inside it was taken by the lake, Mr. Whoppit had floated to the surface, the only passenger to return. The crowd on the shore was quiet. Not silent. Silence implies an absence of feeling, but quiet in the way that people become when they are witnessing something they do not entirely know how to feel about. Relief, perhaps. Grief, certainly. And something harder to name. The strange vertigo of a story that should have ended decades ago finally reaching its conclusion on an overcast Tuesday in spring. Gina Campbell watched. The lake watched back. To understand why her father climbed into that cabin on a freezing January morning, why he settled himself behind the controls knowing, perhaps believing, that he would not climb out, you must begin not with him, but with someone else entirely. With the man whose glory he inherited, whose approval he craved, and whose ghost he chased across every lake and salt flat on earth. His father, Sir Malcolm Campbell, was born on the 11th of March, 1885. He became, in time, the fastest man alive, Knight of the Realm, national hero, holder of records on both land and water at a moment when Britain desperately needed heroes. He named every vehicle he ever raced Bluebird, a choice drawn from Maurice Maeterlinck's symbolist play Eloiso Blue, in which two children journey across the world searching for the blue bird of happiness, only to discover at the end that it was waiting at home all along. Whether Malcolm appreciated the irony of that parable is unclear. He was not a man given to self-reflection. He was large, forceful, consumed by his own ambitions. He possessed the kind of charisma that fills a room so completely there is no air left for anyone else to breathe. He brought home trophies, press cuttings, and the lingering smell of engine oil and champagne. What he did not bring home, by most accounts, was warmth. Into this household, grand, restless, flavored with petrol and fame, a son was born on the 23rd of March, 1921. The birth was registered in Kingston upon Thames, Surrey, though the family was living at the time near Hawley at a property called Povey Cross. The boy was christened Donald Malcolm Campbell. He had an older sister, Jean, and from the earliest age he understood with the wordless clarity of children the hierarchy of the house. His father was the son. Everything else, wife, children, furniture, dogs, orbited at a respectful distance. Jean would later remember their childhood differently from her brother. She described their father as softer than Donald made him out to be, capable of affection, if not exactly lavish with it. But children raised in the same household often grow up in different families. The quiet daughter who accepted her place may have genuinely experienced a gentler man. The son who needed to be seen, to be heard, to matter, he may have experienced something altogether colder. There is an anecdote, recorded by the biographer David Tremaine, that captures this with painful economy. At school, young Donald, aged 11 or 12, would set out signed photographs of his father on a desk and sell them to classmates. "A shilling apiece. My father signed this one himself," he would say, holding up a glossy print of Sir Malcolm beside a gleaming bluebird. "Personally, just last week." It was not about the money. Money meant nothing to a child who lived in a house with grounds and servants. It was about the transaction. For a shilling, a boy would look at the photograph, and then, even if only for a moment, he would look at Donald. The photograph was the bridge. Without it, the boy feared he was invisible. Evenings at the Campbell household had their own ritual. Malcolm would bring guests home, pilots, journalists, racing men with oil under their fingernails and stories that smelled of burnt rubber. The children would be summoned, brought out like polished ornaments, made to say good night politely, and then sent back upstairs. Jean recalled these occasions with a gentle smile, as one recalls the harmless eccentricities of a bygone era. Donald did not smile when he spoke of them. For Jean, the ritual was quaint. For her brother, it was a verdict. "You are not yet worthy of this room." Then there was the illness. Rheumatic fever struck at 15 or 16, a cruel, capricious ailment that weakened his heart, and more consequentially for his sense of self, barred him from service in the Royal Air Force when war came. This was 1939. He was 18. His contemporaries were enlisting, proving themselves in Spitfires and Lancasters. Donald Campbell was told he could not join them, not because he lacked nerve, not because he was unwilling, but because his heart, literally, physically, was not strong enough. He spent the war years working as an engineer and in various maintenance roles, useful but unglamorous. It gnawed at him. In a Britain that measured manhood by sacrifice, he had been denied the opportunity to sacrifice anything at all. He left the family home at 18. The fever had come earlier, and its consequences followed him out the door. This was a departure, not a liberation. You can walk out of a house, but you cannot walk out of a legacy. The name followed him. The expectations followed him. And the question, asked by strangers at parties, by the face in the shaving mirror every morning, followed him most persistently of all. What will the son of Malcolm Campbell do with his life? For a while the answer was, not very much. He drifted through small business ventures, mechanical work, a life competent but unremarkable. He gambled horses, cards, the odd flutter, with the restlessness of a man who needed risk the way others needed routine. He joined the Ghost Club, one of the oldest paranormal investigation societies in the world, attending seances and discussing hauntings with the earnest fascination of someone searching for answers in places where rational men did not look. Then, on the 31st of December, 1948, Sir Malcolm Campbell died. He was 63. His son was 27. The death changed everything and nothing. Everything, because the conversation Donald had been trying to have with his father all his life was now permanently impossible. There would be no moment of recognition, no hand on the shoulder, no quiet word of approval over a glass of whiskey. The old man was gone, and with him went the possibility of resolution. Nothing, because the absence of a living father merely transformed him into something more powerful, a dead one, a myth, a standard etched in granite. You cannot outrun a living man. He tires, he ages, he falters. But you can never outrun a ghost. For 3 years after Malcolm's death, Donald Campbell lived in the gap between grief and purpose. He married, had a child, tried to build something ordinary, but the ordinary would not hold. And then another man died, not a relative, not a friend, but a fellow pursuer of velocity, and something that had been sleeping inside Donald Campbell woke up. John Cobb was a London fur broker, a quiet, self-effacing man who happened to hold the world land speed record. On the 29th of September 1952, he took his jet-powered boat Crusader onto Loch Ness in an attempt to break the water speed record. At approximately 206 miles per hour, the craft disintegrated. Cobb was killed instantly. For many, the death was a tragedy that underscored the lunacy of high-speed attempts. For Donald Campbell, it was something else. A summons, a dare. A door swinging open in a dark corridor. In the weeks that followed, a decision crystallized. He would build his own Bluebird, take it onto the water, and beat the records his father had once held. Not match them, beat them. The machine that emerged was designated Bluebird K7, a jet-propelled hydroplane, slender as a needle, painted the same blue that Malcolm had favored. She was beautiful in the way that all instruments of extreme purpose are beautiful, without compromise, without softness, without mercy. On the 23rd of July, 1955, Donald Campbell took Bluebird K7 onto Ullswater in the Lake District and achieved a speed of 202.32 miles per hour, shattering the world water speed record. He was 34 years old. His father had been dead for 7 years. When he climbed out of the cabin, soaked, trembling, grinning in a way that was equal parts triumph and bewilderment, a small cluster of journalists and team members cheered from the shore. Cameras clicked. On the instrument panel behind him, wedged into its customary spot, sat a small stuffed bear with button eyes. "Jolly good run," he told the press, still dripping. "Jolly good run indeed." He said it brightly with a laugh. But the word that mattered was not jolly or good or run. It was the word he did not say. The word he would never say because no number of records could make it true. Enough. Later that year, during testing on Lake Mead in Nevada, Bluebird K7 sank. The team recovered her, patched her, strengthened her hull. It should have been a warning. But Donald Campbell had never been good at hearing warnings, his own or anyone else's. The pull of the next record, the next chance to push the needle further, was too strong. It was not courage, exactly. Courage implies a choice. This was something closer to compulsion. But before we follow him into the years of triumph that consumed the late 50s and 60s, before the salt flats and the speedometers and the newspaper headlines, there is another story to tell. Quieter, less dramatic, but no less important. It is the story of the women who loved him, who tried to hold him, and who discovered, each in her own way, that loving a man in flight is a particular kind of loneliness. He married for the first time in 1945, the year the war ended and the world exhaled. Her name was Daphne Harvey, a respectable young woman from a respectable family, the sort of person one married in post-war Britain when one wished to signal that the chaos was over and normal life could now commence. She represented stability, domesticity, the quiet architecture of home. Their daughter was born during this marriage, Georgina, called Gina, the only child Donald Campbell would ever have. The records disagree on when she arrived. Wikipedia gives the 19th of September, 1949, while Gina's own recollections suggest an earlier year, perhaps 46. The discrepancy has never been resolved. What matters is simpler and sadder. She was a small girl with a famous surname and a father she barely saw. The marriage lasted 6 years. By 1951, it was over. Daphne had wanted a husband who came home in the evenings, who noticed what was for dinner, who remembered birthdays without being reminded. What she got instead was a man whose eyes were always somewhere else, on the horizon, on the water, on the speedometer. Gina stayed with her mother. The house was quiet after that. Too quiet for a child who did not yet understand why her world had halved. "Where's Daddy gone?" She asked it at breakfast, staring at the empty chair across the table. She asked it at bedtime, when the hallway was dark and the house creaked in ways it hadn't before. Her mother would pause a fraction too long and say something about Daddy being busy, Daddy being away, Daddy doing important things. The child nodded, because children nod when they sense that the truth is something adults cannot say out loud. The empty chair remained. Donald married again the following year. Dorothy McKegg was a New Zealander, vivid, self-possessed, with the kind of directness that comes from growing up at the far edge of the world, where British Reserve holds less currency. She brought energy and warmth into the household. More importantly, for little Gina during her visits, she brought something the child had been starving for: attention. Gina would later describe Dorothy as the first real lady in my life, the woman who pulled her out of solitude, who noticed her, who treated her not as the residue of a failed marriage, but as a person deserving of care. It is a striking phrase. It implies that all the women who came before had somehow failed to fully arrive in the child's emotional world. Whether this was fair to Daphne is another question. Grief distorts memory. The second marriage lasted 5 years. By 1957, Dorothy too had gone. The pattern was the same. The man vanished into his machines, and the woman left standing on the shore eventually turned and walked away. 2 wives departed. The records remained, and Donald Campbell absorbed entirely the wrong lesson. He concluded that love and velocity were fundamentally incompatible, that the narrow seat behind the controls demanded a solitude no marriage could survive. He was wrong, but he would not discover this until a December evening in London, when a Belgian woman with a sharp tongue and no patience for British self-pity walked into his life and refused to leave. They met at the Savoy. It was December 1958, a reception or a party, the precise occasion blurred by time and the haze of what happened next. She was Tonia Byrne, a cabaret singer from Belgium, born on the Flemish coast. She had the kind of continental frankness that made English gentlemen either fall in love or flee. He was famous, twice divorced, 37 years old, and carrying a loneliness so vast it had its own weather system. The accounts of their meeting come primarily from Tonia herself, from her memoir My Speed King, and from interviews she gave in the years after his death. Her version has the vividness of something remembered not just with the mind, but with the body. He approached her, or she approached him. The sequence no longer matters. What matters is the exchange. "I know who you are," she told him. "The man who goes faster than anyone on water and slower than anyone ordering a cocktail." He laughed, a real laugh, not the polished chuckle he deployed for journalists, but something raw and slightly startled, as though he had not expected to be ambushed by wit at a drinks party. Within hours, by her own account, they were together, not in the euphemistic sense. They married at Christmas, Caxton Hall, Westminster. The courtship had lasted approximately 3 weeks. To outside observers, it looked reckless. To Donald and Tonia, it felt like the first honest thing either of them had ever done. Tonia gave up her singing career. She had built a life on stage, on her voice, on the particular alchemy of holding a room with nothing but a melody and a microphone. She surrendered all of it, not because he demanded it, but because the life he led consumed everything around it, like a furnace. There was no oxygen left for a separate career. She became part of the Bluebird team, not a mascot, not a decoration, a working member. She learnt the rhythms of the operation, the weather checks, the fuel calculations, the endless waiting for conditions that might never come. The mechanics gave her a nickname. They called her Fred. The reason has been lost, perhaps a joke about her unglamorous work clothes, perhaps simply the kind of name men give to someone they have accepted as one of their own. Tonia wore it with amusement. The marriage was, by her own frank admission, a thing of extraordinary intensity. "In our marriage," she told The Guardian in 2002, "at least 50% was sex. We weren't saints, but we were in love." Donald, she insisted, was not the domineering figure the press imagined. He was needy, uncertain, prone to self-doubt that would have astonished anyone who had only seen him in the cabin of a racing craft. He needed reassurance constantly, urgently, and in quantities that sometimes exhausted those around him. Tonia gave it not from submission, but from understanding. She saw what his previous wives had not. The bravado was armor, and inside the armor was a boy still selling photographs in a schoolyard, still looking up at the sky for a father who would never look back. They had their rituals, their private language, their jokes that made sense to no one else. One story, recounted in Tonia's memoir, captures the texture of their intimacy with startling candor. Donald had visited what was euphemistically known as a massage parlor, a minor transgression, the sort of thing that happened in the world of 1960s sporting men and was usually filed under indiscretions best not discussed. When he came home, Tonia was waiting. "That'll be $100, darling," she said. He paid. They both dissolved into laughter, helpless, conspiratorial, the kind that is only possible between two people who have agreed completely that the rules governing their love are their own to write. The press told a different story. Newspapers dealt in archetypes, and the archetype assigned to the Campbells was the volcanic marriage. spectacular rows, passionate reconciliations, whispered affairs. Tonia addressed this directly, years later, with a weariness that suggested she had been correcting the same misapprehension for decades. Our marriage was not open, she said. Donald had very few affairs, if any, and the ones people talked about were blown out of all proportion. No named lovers or mistresses appear in any credible source. The truth was less sensational and more poignant than the rumor. Two imperfect people, deeply attached, navigating a life that was by any rational standard insane. There were losses that no amount of humor could soften. Tonia suffered 2 miscarriages during the marriage. They had no children together. This absence, the empty room that was never filled, added a dimension of grief that neither spoke about publicly. But it was there. Quiet ache beneath the noise of engines and champagne corks. Tonia accepted him entirely. The private rituals, the neediness, the stuffed bear in the cabin, the midnight card games, the terror of the color green. She did not try to fix him because she understood that the broken parts were inseparable from the parts that blazed. She did not try to stop him. Perhaps she should have. But stopping Donald Campbell would have been like stopping weather. You could complain about it. You could take shelter from it. You could not make it cease. The years between 1955 and 1963 were a long, ascending arc. Record after record on water, each surpassing the last, each requiring more from the machine and more from the man. But Donald was not satisfied with water alone. Water was his father's element. To truly step beyond the old man's reach, he needed land as well. The vehicle built for this purpose was Bluebird CN7, a sleek, 4-wheeled projectile designed for the world land speed record. The target was 400 miles per hour. The chosen venue was Lake Eyre, a vast, dry salt lake in the South Australian desert, so remote and featureless it seemed less like Earth than another planet entirely. The campaign began in 1962 and immediately descended into farce. It rained. Not the polite English drizzle that dampens picnics, but torrential, absurd, almost biblical rain that flooded the salt flat and turned the track into a shallow sea. The irony was exquisite. The man who had made his name on water was now defeated by water in a desert. Day after day, week after week, the team waited. The press grew hostile. He was wasting time. He was wasting money. He was chasing a record that no longer mattered. BP, the petroleum company that had sponsored his efforts, severed the relationship. Donald was left in the desert with an expensive machine, a dwindling team, and a press corps that smelled failure. Tonia was there. Fred, in work trousers and desert dust, brewing tea, deflecting journalists, holding the operation together with quiet ferocity. A reporter from London cornered Donald outside the team's tent. The heat was savage. The track was flooded. The headline was already written in the journalist's mind. "Mr. Campbell, when will you concede defeat?" Donald looked at him. He was gaunt, sunburned, running on caffeine and stubbornness. When the lake dries, or I do, whichever comes first. The lake dried. On the 17th of July, 1964, Bluebird CN7 roared across the salt at 403.1 miles per hour. World land speed record. The boy who had sold photographs in a school corridor had done what Sir Malcolm never managed. He had conquered both elements, water and earth. Both. 5 months later, on the 31st of December, the last day of the year, as though timing itself were part of the performance, He took Bluebird K7 onto Lake Dumlayung in Western Australia and achieved 276.33 miles per hour on water. It was his seventh water speed record, the last of the series that had begun on Ullswater 9 years earlier. No one in history had ever held both the land and water speed records simultaneously in the same calendar year. No one has done it since. For a single, luminous moment, Donald Campbell stood at the absolute summit of human velocity, the fastest man on Earth and on water, alive and breathing and grinning his complicated grin in the Australian sun. Any other man would have stopped. 2 world records, a place in history that could never be erased, a wife who loved him with a ferocity that matched his own, a name, finally, irrevocably, his own name written in the language of achievement. But the man beside the stuffed bear on the instrument panel did not know the word that might have saved his life, the word that might have let him climb out, walk away, grow old, watch his daughter marry, hold a grandchild, sit in a garden somewhere and listen to the birds. He had never learnt it, and so instead of stopping, he began to plan his next run. The target was 300 miles per hour on water, a clean number, a round number. The kind of figure that looks inevitable on paper and suicidal in practice. No hydroplane had ever traveled that fast. At such velocities, water ceases to behave like a liquid and begins to act like concrete. The margin between a record and a catastrophe narrows to something thinner than a thought. Donald Campbell knew this. He was not an ignorant man. He understood aerodynamics, hydrodynamics, the behavior of turbine engines at extreme output. He understood, with the cold precision of an engineer, exactly what could go wrong. And yet, in November 1966, the Bluebird team arrived at Coniston Water. It was a homecoming of sorts. Campbell had broken records here before, and the lake, narrow and relatively sheltered by the surrounding fells, offered conditions that were at least theoretically suitable. But November in the English Lake District is not Australia. The light is grey, the air is raw, the water is the colour of slate, and the hills that rise on either side hold the cold like cupped hands. From the start, the weather refused to cooperate. Wind stirred the surface into chop. Rain fell in curtains. Fog settled in the mornings and sometimes did not lift until afternoon. Day after day, the team prepared the boat, checked the instruments, monitored the wind gauges, and waited. Day after day, the lake said no. The financial pressure was acute. Sponsors had grown scarce after the difficulties at Lake Eyre. Every day of inactivity cost money Donald did not have. He was borrowing against the presumed value of a record not yet set, against a future that was becoming increasingly uncertain. The mechanics noticed the strain. He was thinner, quieter. The jokes came less frequently, and when they did, they carried an edge. Tonia was at Coniston. She was always wherever the Bluebird went, Fred in her weatherproof jacket, making tea, managing logistics, watching the sky with the same intensity the meteorologist watched it, though she was reading a different kind of forecast. She watched her husband. She noted the silences. She did not speak of what she saw. To name a fear is sometimes to make it real. The team settled into a rhythm of frustration. Morning briefings that ended with the same conclusion: not today. Afternoons in the workshop, tinkering with an engine that was ready for a lake that was not ready for it. Evenings in the rented cottage, where the talk was of wave height and the maddening unpredictability of English water in winter. Then came the night of the 3rd of January, 1967. The story has been told many times by those who were there. The details vary at the edges. The center holds firm. Donald Campbell was playing patience, not tarot, ordinary playing cards laid out on a table in the quiet of the evening. The cottage was warm. Outside, the lake was dark. The fells were invisible against a sky without stars. He turned a card, the ace of spades. He turned another, the queen of spades. He stared at them. Donald Campbell had spent a lifetime accumulating private rituals and prohibitions. The banished color, the shunned number, the feared day of the week. He knew the histories attached to certain cards the way a priest knows scripture. The ace and queen of spades appearing together. The same combination, so the legend goes, that Mary Queen of Scots turned over on the night before her execution at Fotheringhay Castle in 1587. He spoke. The words have been preserved by those who heard them, repeated in biographies and documentaries with a consistency that suggests they were branded into every memory present. Mary Queen of Scots turned up the same cards the night before her execution. I know that one of the Donalds is going to cop it. I pray it's not me. One of the Donalds. The phrasing is remarkable for its strange, almost whimsical precision. Not I am going to die. Not something dreadful will happen. But one of the Donalds is going to cop it, as though death were a bureaucratic matter, a notice served on the wrong address, and there remained a slim chance that the postman might deliver it to the other door. No one laughed. No one suggested that the cards were merely cards. They knew him too well for that. In the private cosmology of Donald Campbell, signs were real. The universe spoke if you listened. And that evening it was speaking clearly. He did not cancel the run. This is the detail that resists easy explanation. He believed the cards. He said as much. He was afraid, not with the theatrical fear of a man performing bravery, but with the genuine, marrow-deep dread of someone who had seen his own death announced in a pattern of ink on cardboard. And yet he did not stand up from the table and say, "We are going home." Why? The honest answer is, no one knows. The financial pressure was immense. Another day's delay meant money he did not have. The weather forecast for the following morning was marginally better than it had been for weeks. There was the pride of a man who had staked his identity on not flinching. And there was, perhaps, something darker, the fatalism of someone who had been running for so long that the prospect of stopping felt more terrifying than whatever lay at the end of the run. Tonia was there that night. In later interviews, she spoke of premonitions, of a heaviness in the air, of a feeling she could not name. She did not say she tried to stop him. She did not say she didn't. That evening, after the cards were put away, she sat beside him and they talked about what she never disclosed. The silence on this point is its own kind of eloquence. Morning came. The 4th of January, a Wednesday. The lake was relatively calm, not glassy, not perfect, but better than it had been in weeks. A thin mist hung over the water, softening the outlines of the fells. The temperature hovered just above freezing. The team prepared Bluebird K7. Fuel loaded. Instruments checked. The jet engine tested and found responsive. Everything in order. Donald Campbell climbed into the cabin. He settled into the seat, that narrow, padded cradle from which he had emerged alive 7 times before. On the instrument panel, in its customary position, sat the small stuffed bear. Button eyes forward, patient, ready, the canopy closed. At approximately 8 o'clock, Bluebird was launched onto the water. The plan was straightforward in concept and ferocious in execution. Accelerate along a measured kilometer, reach maximum velocity, then turn around and make a return pass in the opposite direction within a specified time. The official record would be the average of the two runs. It was the return, always the return, that carried the greatest danger. The first pass left a wake, and a wake at 300 miles per hour is not a gentle ripple, but a series of pressure waves capable of destabilizing even the most precisely engineered hull. Standard procedure was to complete the first pass, slow down, wait for the wake to subside, and only then begin the return. At approximately 20 past 8, Bluebird completed the first pass through the measured kilometer. The speed was staggering, approximately 297 miles per hour. A good run, a very good run. The team on the shore noted the figures and waited for the boat to slow, to circle, to settle. It did not slow. This is the hinge on which the entire story turns. The fraction of a second that separated a world in which Donald Campbell grew old from the one in which he did not. Instead of decelerating and waiting for the water to calm, he maintained power and began his return pass almost immediately. The wake from the first run, those invisible pressure ridges traveling outward across Coniston, had not yet dissipated. He was driving back into his own turbulence. Why? Anxiety about fuel levels, a mechanical issue, the pressure of timing, simple impatience, or something that cannot be spoken aloud in an engineering report, the pull of the cards, the bone-deep sense that if he slowed down now he would never speed up again because the courage would leave him, and without the courage there was nothing. Whatever the reason, Bluebird K7 entered the return kilometer at full power. The onboard radio was live. The recording that exists, preserved on magnetic tape, listened to by millions in the decades since, is the most intimate document of Donald Campbell's life. More intimate than any photograph, any interview, any memoir. It is the sound of a man alone with his machine and his fate, narrating his own final moments with a calm that defies comprehension. Pitching a bit down here, coming through our own wash. His voice is steady, conversational almost. The accent is clipped English of its era. There is no panic in it. Getting straightened up now on the track. The speedometer is climbing. The hull is riding high, balanced on its planing surfaces, skimming the water at a height measured in inches. Rather close to Peel Island. Peel Island, a small, tree-covered mound near the center of the lake, familiar to every child who has read Arthur Ransom. He notes it as one might note a signpost on a country road. Calmly, in passing. Tramping like mad, and she's just about on the step. On the step, the point at which a planing hull rides at its most efficient angle, fully up, barely touching the surface. This is where records live. This is also where the margin for error ceases to exist. I can see the water is beginning to break behind. Behind him, the wake, his own wake, the water is breaking, a pause, perhaps half a second. I'm going. 2 words, present tense, not a prediction. He is going into the air, into the water, into whatever waits at the end of velocity. I'm on my back. Bluebird has lifted. The bow caught a wave, his own wave, the ghost of his own passage, and rose. The craft is airborne, pitching backward, nose toward the grey sky, tail toward the grey water. Then the final words. I've gone. Not help me. Not any of the things one might expect. Simply, "I've gone," past tense, completed, as though he had already crossed a threshold and was reporting back from the other side. The recording ends. On the shore, the scene that followed has been described by every witness in essentially the same terms. Bluebird struck Coniston Water at approximately 328 miles per hour. The forward section shattered on contact. The main body somersaulted, broke apart, and sank. A plume of spray rose and hung in the air. Then stillness. Tonia was on the bank. The team was on the bank. Cameras were on the bank. They all saw the same thing, the boat rising, turning, falling, disappearing. And then the water closing over the place where it had been, as smoothly and completely as though nothing had happened at all. Almost nothing. Floating on the surface, amid scattered fragments, rocking gently in the diminishing ripples, was a small object. Soft. It bobbed with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. A little stuffed bear, grey with age, turned toward the sky. He had floated free, the constant passenger, the silent witness, and he had surfaced. His owner had not. For what felt like minutes but was probably seconds, no one on the shore moved, no one spoke. There was nothing to move toward and nothing to say. The rescue boats went out. They found debris. They found the bear. They did not find Donald Campbell. The lake had taken him, drawn him down into the deep, and closed above him without a seam. He was 45 years old. In the days that followed, an inquiry was opened. Experts examined the wreckage, studied the film footage, analyzed the radio transmission. The conclusion: loss of control caused by riding over the wake at excessive speed. Engine failure was considered and set aside. The possibility of a bird strike was mentioned but never substantiated. The theory that Donald Campbell had deliberately sought his own death was examined and formally rejected. The coroner found no evidence of suicidal intent. And yet the question lingers. He knew the risks. He saw the cards. He heard the warning in every superstition he had ever held. And he climbed in anyway, placed the bear on the panel, closed the canopy, and went. Perhaps the simplest explanation is also the truest. He could not do otherwise. Not because he wanted to die, but because the alternative, the silence, the stillness, the long grey expanse of a life at ordinary pace, was something he had never learnt to endure. There was no body. Coniston Water, barely 5 miles long, less than half a mile wide, had swallowed Donald Campbell so completely that no diver, no sonar, no technology available in 1967 could locate his remains. Wreckage was found in fragments on the lake bed. The man himself had vanished into the tannin-dark cold as though he had never existed. For a family, the absence of a body is a particular kind of cruelty. It denies the rituals that grief requires: the viewing, the coffin, the lowered earth, the stone with dates carved into it. It leaves a door permanently ajar. Not open, not closed, but ajar, admitting a draft of maybe that chills everything it touches. 3 lives were reshaped by that absence. 3 women were left to navigate a world in which Donald Campbell was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. In the newspapers, in the history books, in the national memory, but not in any place where you could lay flowers or speak to the ground and pretend to be heard. Tonia was approximately 37 when she became a widow. She had surrendered her career, her independence, her identity as a performer to become Fred, the woman in work trousers who brewed tea and loved a man who loved machines more than safety. Now the machines had taken him, and she was left with the trousers and the tea, and a silence that no amount of activity could fill. She did not remarry for decades, year after year of sleeping alone in a bed that was too wide, of reaching for a telephone to share a piece of news and remembering mid-dial that there was no one on the other end. She kept his papers. She kept his photographs. She kept the memory of their marriage with a ferocity that was part love and part defiance, defiance of the press, which had reduced their relationship to tabloid shorthand, and defiance of time, which was slowly burying him beneath layers of newer, louder stories. She was alone in her flat, a year after the crash, perhaps two. On the shelf behind her, a photograph, Donald in his racing overalls, grinning that complicated grin. On the chair beside the door, a jacket he once wore. She had not moved it. Moving it would mean he was not coming back, and while she knew this, had known it since 8:31 on the morning of the 4th of January, knowing and accepting are not the same thing. They are not even neighbors. The telephone rang. A journalist calling about the anniversary. They always called about the anniversary. They wanted quotes, reactions, tears if possible. She hung up without speaking. Eventually, she wrote her book. My Speed King was published not for money and not for fame, but for correction. She wanted people to know what he was really like, not the newspaper hero, the man. The book is frank about the physicality of their marriage, about his vulnerabilities, about the private negotiations that all couples make and that famous couples make under additional pressure. It is also, beneath the candor, a love letter written by a woman who had outlived its recipient by decades and who refused to let the world remember him wrong. And then there was Gina. Georgina Campbell was 17 when her father died. Perhaps 20, the records disagree. She had spent her childhood on the periphery of his life, catching glimpses of him between records, reading about him in newspapers. She was his daughter in the biological sense, and in the emotional sense of carrying his name, his legacy, and the particular wound that comes from being the child of someone who was always somewhere else. The years after his death were brutal. Gina has spoken about this publicly, with a courage that mirrors her father's willingness to enter dangerous spaces. She suffered depression. She attempted to take her own life. The details are hers and not for embellishment here, but the fact is important because it speaks to the cost of being left behind by someone who chose a cabin over a living room again and again until the cabin chose for him. What happened next is either extraordinary or inevitable, depending on how you understand the mechanics of inherited compulsion. In her 30s, Gina Campbell began pursuing speed records on water, not abstractly, not as a hobby or a tribute. She found a boat, a Dorian dory, designed craft, and took it onto a lake and opened the throttle and felt beneath her the same tremor of force that her father had felt and his father before him. The spray hit her face. The engine screamed. And for a few seconds, just a few, the distance between the living daughter and the dead father closed to nothing. Someone on the shore, the name has been lost, but the words have not, watched her climb out afterward and said 5 words that contained everything. You're just like your father. She heard it. She did not answer, because what could she say? The sentence was simultaneously a compliment, an observation, and a prophecy, and she could not tell which of these she was supposed to accept. Was she trying to understand him, to reach him, to finish what he started? Or was she simply enacting, without choice, the same pattern that had driven Malcolm to drive and Donald to fly and the bluebird to accelerate beyond the limits of what metal and water could bear? The Campbells did not merely pursue velocity. They were pursued by it, hunted by a compulsion that passed from generation to generation like a title nobody wanted, but nobody could refuse. For 34 years, the lake held its secret. Coniston became a place of pilgrimage for a certain kind of visitor, not tourists exactly, but people who came to stand on the shore and look at the water and think about what lay beneath it. There was a memorial, modest and dignified, and in the Ruskin Museum on Udall Road, alongside the Victorian writer's watercolours and geological specimens, a small collection of Campbell artefacts accumulated: photographs, newspaper cuttings, engineering drawings. And behind glass, slightly apart from the rest, a small stuffed bear with button eyes, Mr. Whoppit, retrieved from the surface on the morning of the 4th of January, dried, cleaned, placed in a case. He had been the constant passenger, present for every triumph and every terror. Visitors paused before him and felt, without quite knowing why, that they were looking at something more than a toy. In the late 1990s, Bill Smith began looking for Bluebird. Smith was not an archaeologist or a naval engineer. He was a diver and an enthusiast, a man possessed by the same quality that had possessed the Campbells, the inability to leave a thing unfinished. Using side-scan sonar, he and his team surveyed the bed of Coniston systematically, pass by pass, in water so dark that visibility at depth was measured in inches. The lake bed was silty, featureless, and disinclined to reveal its contents. But Smith was patient in the way that water is patient, not passive, but relentless. They found the wreckage, sections of hull, fragments of the engine housing, pieces of the cabin structure, bent and corroded but recognizable. And then, in the spring of 2001, they found him. The cold, peaty water had preserved his remains. For 34 years, while the world above remade itself entirely, Donald Campbell had lain in the deep, unchanged, held in a kind of suspended present by the chemistry of the lake that killed him. Gina received a telephone call. We found him. 2 words. 34 years of the door being ajar, 34 years of the draft. And now, at last, it could close, not comfortably, not painlessly, but finally. The wreckage of Bluebird K7 was raised in stages. A restoration project began, meticulous, controversial, agonizingly slow. Bill Smith dedicated years to reconstruction. Whether the craft should run again or rest as a relic remains an open question, another inheritance that proves impossible to settle. The funeral took place on the 12th of September, 2001. The date deserves attention because history, which has no sense of propriety, had arranged a collision. The day before, the 11th of September, 2 aircraft had been flown into the towers of the World Trade Center in New York. The world was in shock. Every newspaper, every television bulletin, every conversation in every pub and kitchen was consumed by the images from Manhattan. Against this backdrop, the quiet burial of a speed record holder who had died 34 years earlier barely registered. The church was in Coniston. The graveyard was in Coniston. The lake was visible from the graveside, that same stretch of water, grey and flat and indifferent, that had been the arena, the instrument of death, and the unmarked grave. Gina was there, standing beside the open ground, looking at the lake she had spent her life trying simultaneously to flee and to return to. Tonia was there. She stood slightly apart from the crowd, as she always had, near enough to see, far enough to grieve privately. 2 women at one grave. a wife and a daughter. Two different losses, two different Donalds they had each loved and each, in different ways, lost. The coffin was lowered into English earth. After 34 years in water, he was finally on solid ground. A stone would bear his name, his dates: the 23rd of March, 1921, the 4th of January, 1967, and nothing more. Donald Campbell had spent his life courting the attention of the press, needing their cameras and headlines the way a plant needs light. And his funeral, the final act, took place on the one day in modern history when every camera on Earth was pointed somewhere else. The fastest man on water, buried in the slowest of news cycles. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor even darker than his own. But perhaps there was mercy in it too. Perhaps the absence of flashbulbs and shouted questions allowed something rare, a private farewell, a daughter at a graveside, a wife at a distance, a stone in the earth, the sound of wind over water. And somewhere, in a museum half a mile away, a stuffed bear behind glass, gazing at nothing, remembering everything. The Ruskin Museum stands on Udall Road in Coniston Village, a modest building of local stone that makes no particular effort to announce itself. The kind of place you might walk past on a wet afternoon without giving it a second glance. Inside, the work of John Ruskin occupies most of the space, the legacy of a man who came to Coniston for beauty, not velocity. But in an adjacent room, the air changes. Photographs line the walls. Bluebird on the water, Bluebird on the salt, Donald in his overalls, Donald on the shore, Donald grinning for the cameras with that expression that was never quite simple enough to be called a smile. Engineering drawings, faded and foxed. Newspaper cuttings preserved behind glass, their headlines still shouting in the bold typefaces of a vanished era. A section of hull, a twisted piece of metal that was once part of something beautiful and fast and is now merely evidence. And in a case of its own, slightly apart from the machinery and the paper, a small stuffed bear. He is roughly the size of a man's hand. His fur, once golden or brown, the original color is disputed, has faded to an indeterminate gray. The color of lake water, the color of old clouds. His button eyes are intact. His expression, if a button-eyed bear can be said to have an expression, is one of mild and permanent attention, as though he is waiting for something he is confident will eventually arrive. Mr. Whoppit. He had been there since at least 1955, possibly earlier. The precise circumstances of his arrival in Donald Campbell's life are unrecorded, which seems appropriate for an object whose significance was entirely private. He was not a gift from a lover, not a childhood relic, not a trophy. He was simply a bear, small, soft, unremarkable, adopted by a man whose life was defined by the hard, the fast, and the loud. He rode in the cabin on every record attempt. The mechanics, those taciturn men of precision and metal, never questioned his presence. In the world of Bluebird, a world of jet turbines and fuel mixtures calculated to the ounce and hull angles measured to the fraction of a degree, Mr. Whoppit occupied a space that no instrument could fill. The irrational heart of a rational enterprise, the soft center of a hard machine. Perhaps the simplest reading is also the most accurate. Mr. Whoppit was the part of Donald Campbell that was still a child. The boy in the schoolyard, selling photographs. The boy sent upstairs to say good night. The boy whose heart was too weak for the war but too strong for a quiet life. That boy never hardened, never disappeared. He simply moved into a stuffed bear and rode along, watching everything, saying nothing. On the morning of the 4th of January, 1967, Mr. Whoppit was in his usual place when Bluebird lifted from Coniston Water and turned over in the air. When the cabin shattered and the lake rushed in, the bare, weightless, buoyant, made of nothing more than fabric and stuffing, floated free. He rose through the dark water and broke the surface while his owner sank. He had done the only thing a stuffed bear can do. He had survived, and in surviving he had become something more than a toy, a witness, the last one, the only one who was there at the end, who shared the final seconds and emerged to tell a tale he could not speak. The visitors to the Ruskin Museum who pause before his case, and most do pause, even those who came for the watercolors and know nothing of speed, tend to fall quiet. There is something in the sight of him that bypasses the intellect and reaches for something older. A child's toy in a glass case. A survivor. A keeper of secrets that will never be told. 3 generations of Campbells pursued the Bluebird. Sir Malcolm, the patriarch, gave the name to every vehicle he raced. For him, Bluebird was aspiration, the next frontier, the next headline. He chased it with the confidence of a man who believed the world was his to conquer, and he was largely right. He set record after record, received his knighthood, and died in his own bed on the last night of 1948. The Bluebird, for Malcolm, was a means to an end, and the end was glory, and glory was achieved. For Donald, the Bluebird was something different. Not a means to an end, but an end in itself, or, more precisely, a means to an end that could never be reached, because the end kept moving. Every record demanded the next. Every achievement revealed not a summit, but another slope. Malcolm had chased the Bluebird and caught it. Donald chased the Bluebird and was consumed by it. The difference between the two men is the difference between a hunter who knows when to stop and one who cannot, who has confused the chase with the purpose of living and therefore cannot live without it. And Gina. For Gina Campbell, the Bluebird was an inheritance she neither sought nor could refuse. She took to the water not because she wanted to, or perhaps she did. The line between desire and compulsion is not always visible, even to the person crossing it. But because the water was where her father had gone, and going there herself was the closest she could come to finding him. She did not break his records. She did not die in the attempt. She survived, which is its own kind of achievement, the unglamorous, unheroic kind that requires, in its quiet way, more courage than any record run. Metelink's children in the play search everywhere for the blue bird of happiness, the land of memory, the palace of night, the kingdom of the future, and find nothing. They return home, exhausted and disappointed, only to discover that the bird was in their own house all along, in a cage they had overlooked. The moral is gentle and rather French. Happiness is not found in the pursuit, but in the recognition of what is already present. Whether this moral applies to the Campbells is a question without a comfortable answer. Donald named his machines after a symbol of unattainable joy and spent his life proving at tremendous cost that the symbol was accurate. The happiness was always in the next run, the next record, the next needle twitch on the dial. It was never in the cottage at Coniston, or in Tonia's arms, or in the small warm weight of a stuffed bear on an instrument panel. These things were real, and they were good, and they were not enough. Or perhaps they were enough, and he simply never turned around to look. This is the reading that breaks the heart, because it suggests that everything he wanted was already his, and that the tragedy was not the crash but the years before it. The years of searching for something that was sitting on the shelf. We cannot know. The dead keep their own counsel. Tonia Byrne Campbell spent the decades after her husband's death guarding his memory with the tenacity of someone who understood that memory, once it passes into public hands, becomes a commodity, shaped, simplified, sold. She gave interviews sparingly. She corrected inaccuracies with the precision of a woman who had been there and would not tolerate the distortions of those who had not. She carried the story of their marriage, its passion, its chaos, its tenderness, inside her like a second skeleton, a structure that held her upright even when everything around it faltered. On a shelf in her flat, long after the cameras stopped coming, a framed photograph remained. Donald laughing, caught mid-sentence, one hand raised as though conducting an invisible orchestra. It was not the official portrait. It was not the helmet and goggles shot the newspapers preferred. It was just him, laughing, alive. She kept it where she could see it from the kitchen, so that even the smallest act, boiling a kettle, opening a window, took place in his company. Gina Campbell has walked a different path. Where Tonia chose to protect the private man, Gina has grappled publicly with the legacy of being his daughter, the abandonment, the depression, the gravitational pull of the water, the slow and painful work of building a self that is not merely an appendix to someone else's story. She has spoken about her darkest moments with a frankness that cost her a great deal, and that may have saved others who recognized their own darkness in hers. She has pursued velocity and retreated from it. She has lived, in short, the complicated, unglamorous life that follows a heroic death, the life that no one writes ballads about but that demands, every single morning, the decision to keep going. Coniston Water on a winter afternoon is a different place from the lake of the prologue. Not pewter now, but iron, the water darker, the fells sharper, the air carrying the mineral bite of approaching snow. A heron stands in the shallows near the northern shore, motionless, watching the water with the patience of a creature that has been doing exactly this for 60 million years. There are no sailing boats, no kayakers. Only the heron and the water and the memory of sound, a jet engine long silenced, whose echo lives not in the air but in the earth. If you stand at the northern end and look south along the water, there is no marker on the surface. No buoy, no sign. The lake absorbed the event as it absorbs everything, rain, light, silence, and returned to its own purposes. But if you believe in such things, and Donald Campbell, member of the Ghost Club, player of Fateful Patience, reader of signs in the fall of cards, emphatically did then Coniston remembers. Somewhere in the deep, where the temperature never rises above a few degrees, the echo of that morning still reverberates, too low for human hearing, felt rather than heard, like a heartbeat in the earth. On the shore, a stone with a name. In the museum, a bear with button eyes. In the archive, a recording that ends with 2 words spoken in perfect calm. And in the churchyard, finally still, finally silent, finally at rest, a man who spent his whole life running and who found, at the bottom of an English lake, the thing he could never find at the surface. Not velocity, not vindication, not the approving gaze of a father dead before the chase began. Quiet. This was the story of Donald Campbell, a man who could not stop. Perhaps it reminded you of someone, or of something you once chased, across years, across rooms, across the distance between who you are and who you believed you needed to be. If it did, then his story was not only his, it was yours as well. Thank you for listening.